We have what I like to call this fundamental desire that's at the heart of who we are. So another way of describing human beings is we're beings with a desire. And several years ago, some of you have heard me tell the story, I was invited to someone's home for dinner. And after dinner, they produced this bowl of ice cream in front of each one of us. And when I tasted the ice cream, it was chocolate ice cream. And chocolate wasn't my favorite flavor at that point. But when I tasted that chocolate ice cream, it was the best chocolate ice cream I ever tasted. And I said, so what kind of ice cream is this? And they said, oh, it's Publix brand, Chocolate Trinity. So I never forgot the name because it's Trinity. So 3 kinds of chocolate in it. It's a dark chocolate ice cream with dark chocolate little cups in it and something else. It's absolutely fabulous. So I went out and bought a carton, of course. So I always say, you have this desire, and so something comes along like this taste of ice cream that you never tasted before, and it's so delicious when you're eating it, you think, wow, this is really satisfying. It satisfies my hunger. But what happens is, and there's actually a thing in economics class called the law of diminishing returns. Have you ever heard about law? So if you're an economist. But if you go give yourself a second bowl of that ice cream, it's not quite as good as the first bowl. And if you continue to dip more and more bowls of it, in the end, you probably would not want any more of it. So that's a tiny illustration of, you have this desire in us as human beings, and something seems to satisfy or fulfill that desire, but in the end, it doesn't really satisfy it. It's like, okay, now that I've had this wonderful ice cream, what more is there in life? There's got to be something more than a bowl of ice cream. The same thing, by the way, happens with almost every material creation, doesn't it? I bought this car one time with Father Dexter Brewer at the time, about 4 months into me owning this brand new car, says, well, has it happened yet? And I said, that's what happened. And he says, that wonderful feeling of having a new car worn off yet? And I said, not quite yet. I'm sure it will, I always say it wears off a little bit when you get your first dent or scratch. It's like, okay, it's not quite as perfect as it once was. So those are kind of small, humorous examples, of course. But when you move on to bigger things, when you meet a friend for the first time, and a friendship begins to develop. And I remember one time when I was a fairly young person, and I went down to Notre Dame High School in Chattanooga, and got to know one of the other fellow faculty members, and we had an opportunity to visit for the first time, and I thought, wow, this person is a soulmate, we could really talk about deep, important things in life. And there was a sense of, after having had that conversation, of genuine joy and contentment. But the fact of the matter is that no matter how wonderful a friendship is, in the end, it does not fulfill every desire of the human heart. And that's, by the way, one of the things that married couples also learn in the mystery of life. You fall in love with someone. What happens when you fall in love with someone? Well, if you really fall head over heels in love with somebody, you think this is the answer to everything I have in life. So this person is all I ever need in life again. And sometimes you don't even eat. You're like, I'm not even thinking about food anymore. It's kind of like, or sleep. When people really fall in love, it's everything. This person is everything to me. And I will not forget, when I was working at Father Ryan in the 1990s, one of the students who I really liked called me in the middle of the night, and he said, I need to talk to someone. And I said, what's wrong? And he said, I broke up with my girlfriend, and I can't live without her. It was this kind of heart-wrenching emptiness on the inside. And so I talked with him for a while, and I listened to him. And I said, well, how long have you all been dating? And he said, 2 years. I was like, 2 years, Miles. And then it was like forever, you know. And he was 16, and I said, I probably shouldn't say things like this, but I said, what did you do the first 14 years of your life? You know, but that was we had this long-term process of helping walk through that process. But, I mean, the point is that even in the very best relationship you ever have, if you meet your soulmate and you marry that person, and you're happily married for a full lifetime, what happens? It doesn't last forever, does it? One day, one or another of us will not live in this life. And so we're left with that desire unfulfilled. I will never forget when my grandmother, who had been married for so many years, and my grandfather lost him. There was a part of her that never recovered from that. Every single day, she would go to the cemetery as long as she was able to visit his grave. And every night before she went to bed, she kissed his picture in the bedroom and told him good night. You know, so there was this connection that the two of them shared. Now, you know, no relationship is always perfect, you know. So there was a film several years ago, and this guy, he lost his wife. They were married many, many years. And he says, you know, he's plodding down the road, and he says, you know, I just hate the way she always left the lid off this in the refrigerator, and I hated the way she never did that. He's listing the things about her that really got under his skin. And he just burst into tears, and he goes, but I love her, and I miss her, and my life is never going to be. So there's something, you know, fundamental about, we humans have this desire in us that I call a desire for the infinite, but we're not infinite. So we meet the boundaries and the limitations of life. And that's one of the most paradoxical things about being human. So we have this, I think it's ultimately in our being, a quest, a desire for infinite knowledge, infinite love, and infinite goodness. And we're blessed in this life when we get moments, or more than moments, to taste it. But it always leaves us longing for more than this created world and everything in it can offer us, doesn't it? That's the paradox of being human. And I suppose one of the spiritual qualities of being human is that we learn as we get older to appreciate with wonder and gratitude the gift that each day or each element of creation brings without clinging too tightly to it and allowing it to be what it is for the time that we're blessed to have it. So, you know, when I first went to Banff National Park and I saw how beautiful it was, I thought there could be no more beautiful place in all the world. And yet some days, when I'm walking in the winter parks on a particularly crisp October afternoon through the colored trees, I will stop for a moment and let the sunlight soak down upon me, and I will say, God, there is no more beautiful place in all the universe right now for me than this very place and moment. And to be able to stop and to appreciate with wonder and gratitude those moments, while at the same time accepting they are limited. They're not going to go on forever. That's part of the spiritual mystery of being human. So I think it's because of this infinite desire that we have, and the fact that we're not infinite, that we run into the boundaries of our mortality or finitude, that we begin to ask these great questions. So the questions, where did we come from? That's an important question. You know, what's my origin? Where are we going in life? What's my destiny? What am I created for? A third question, important, what's wrong with us? Come back to that one. What's the solution? Now, why are we here at all? So I want to start with one of these great questions. Where did we come from? You know? What's the number one answer, by the way, in the greater culture out there beyond Christianity today? Oh, from my mother's womb, okay. So, yeah, so certainly, Certainly we came from our mother's womb. But when you push that back further, well, that's a good Catholic answer, but is that what our culture is answering today, typically? Yeah. So what's the most commonly accepted scientific theory today about the origin of human beings in the universe?
Big Bang.
All right, I heard the name, the Big Bang. All right, so, and what we call evolution. So let's just take a quick look at science for a moment. So the universe that we're living in, scientists estimate to be somewhere between 12 and 15 billion years old. And our planet Earth, I think, is somewhere between 4 and 5 billion years old. So this universe has been around a lot longer than we human beings have existed. And slowly evolving. The ability for us to understand the temporal dimensions of the universe have radically expanded in the last 100 years. And with things like the Hubble Space Telescope these days, we can actually see far back, because it takes a while for light to get from the stars to us, we actually see back far in time. I remember, so how many light minutes is it from the sun to the planet Earth? Anybody know the answer? Is it 8 minutes? Or about 8 minutes or something like that. So let's say suddenly, it's not going to happen that way, but let's say suddenly the sun vanished, and the light that's traveling from the sun to the earth would keep coming for a full 8 minutes. So we wouldn't know that it disappeared for 8 minutes. Well, that's the closest star to us. The next one is like 4 light years away. So that means if that star were to suddenly disappear, we'd still get light from it. We could still see it in the sky for 4 years until the end of the light would get to us. So, and of course the ones that are far, far away. So we were up in a hot tub one time. This is where we have philosophical discussions with my family in Gatlinburg. And I was explaining this to my brother-in-law that some of the stars that we see in the sky are not there anymore. And he goes, "What do you mean?" I see them right there. I know they're there. And I said, well, I tried to explain, it takes a while. That didn't work on him. He says, "You're not convincing me those stars are not there." I see them. So I said, okay. So this will humorously come up in the intervening years since then. So, but the incredible mystery of such a vast universe, we just had the eclipse, and we have the perfect sized moon that is the perfect sized distance from our planet to perfectly block the entire light of the sun for a few moments, or a few minutes. Well, and all the millions and trillions of stars and planets in the known universe, there are only about 1 in a billion that have the exact right sized moon to exactly give you a total eclipse of the sun, of its nearest star. So that's an amazing mystery that we just saw unfold a few weeks ago. So with all the mystery of the scientific universe, the most common answer, by the way, of scientists for human life is that we evolve from lower forms of life. So the common scientific theories today are simple: life began on this planet in a cellular form, and all the life that you see on this planet has evolved from that simple form of life, gradually through millions of years. And so human beings, when you look at the biological clock on planet Earth, are actually fairly recent in the history of the planet. So last only, 100,000 years or so. That's a lot of time for us, but we're living in the middle of the stream of time. So where do we come from? Well, you could say, well, if you buy the scientific answer, we came from simpler forms of life, you still have to answer the question, where do we come from beyond that point? So all of the elements in our body, by the way, are formed in stars. So the atoms that contain all created things, the planets and so forth, the stars are the great factories that produce those elements in our universe. So the theory about scientists is, about 12 to 15 billion years ago, is that there was a point that is commonly referred to in scientific language as the Big Bang. That moment when the universe began and it expanded extremely rapidly. So a powerful burst of energy and matter. So matter and energy, everything that is, began with one great emanation, if you want to put it that way. And it's been expanding, by the way, ever since these last 12 to 15 billion years. And the question is, will it expand forever or will it retract at some point? There have been two competing schools of thought on that. So, but here's the bottom line. If you push the scientists all the way back to that very beginning, there are some fundamental questions beyond that. Well, how did it all begin, for example?
Who pushed the first electron?
Who pushed that first electron, yeah. Or as one philosopher asked the question, why is there anything rather than nothing at all? So it's not a quote-unquote self-creating universe. It didn't make itself happen. So it's interesting, by the way, when you look at the book of Genesis, and as a poetic presentation of a creation narrative from our Hebrew ancestors, the beginning of chapter 1 in Genesis begins with what? There is in Hebrew the word is tohe wabohu, a chaos, undifferentiated. And the very first thing God says is, let there be light. First thing created, which we call light and energy, and this also has a particle dimension to it. So let there be light. Isn't it fascinating that the first thing that Genesis recounts poetically being created is energy in essence, and the universe is exploding as matter and energy at the beginning? It's interesting because let there be light occurs, I think it's up till the fourth day that the sun and the moon and the stars are created in the Genesis account. So where's the light coming from? So it's an interesting puzzle. All right, so the second great question that all human beings have to ask is, where are we going? What's the end point of human existence? What's the end point of the universe around us? And what's the defining moment for all of us? Defining. What's that defining point? Declining moves us in that direction sometimes. Death, yes. We all have to face the fact that we're mortal beings, that we're going to face death someday. So that's the defining characteristic of the end of human life. So the real question is how we face the mystery of death. And so what, if anything, lies beyond the boundary of death? So in our culture today, in the Western world, we get different answers to that question. So if you're an atheist or an agnostic, that is, if you're an atheist, you don't believe there's anything called God. If you're agnostic, you're not sure if there is. What do you think the answer might be? What happens beyond death? Nothing, yeah. So the answer would be, basically, this is it. Right? So whatever we do in this life, once we meet death, that's the end of everything. The Hindus, by the way, had an interesting and creative answer to this question that has emerged again in 20th century America. Have you heard of samsara in the Hindu language? Or reincarnation. So you have some people who believe that that one of these mortal lifetimes is not all we get. We get a large, sometimes an almost infinite number of them. And so you know, in Hollywood, it's common for some who have picked up the idea that they've been through previous lifetimes and they're going to go through more lifetimes and all that sort of thing. The ancient Hindu understanding, by the way, of samsara is the cycle of rebirth. You could go up or down in your reincarnation. So if you're human now, I'll just do human broadly, and you don't live your life the way you were intended to live it properly, then when you get recycled, you might return as a flea, or a caterpillar, or a butterfly, or a cow, you know. So all beings in Hinduism keep getting recycled, as it were, reborn. And so if you're a ladybug, and you live your life as a ladybug the way ladybugs are supposed to live, next time you might come back as a kitty cat or something, you know, so, a cow or something, you know. And if you live, and the same was true, by the way, in Indian society with human stratification. So the lowest level of human life were the untouchables. They were outside the class system. And then the highest were the Brahmins, the priests. And so the warrior class was right under them, the great kings, and so forth. So if you live your life really well, and you're an outcast in this life, outside the caste system, you might be a Brahmin if you lived it perfectly well in the next one. So you continue to cycle through life. But the point of this endless reincarnation, you can go backward or forward, is eventually moksha, liberation from this cycle of rebirths. And the Buddhist translation would be nirvana, you know, so that flame is finally extinguished. So in this understanding of life, you could go through many different lifetimes. I will also add, Father Joe McMahon and I were talking about this, and he said, "Don't you think once is enough?" And I said, "Yes, I think once is enough." Okay, so, and truly, some people would say, we just don't know what's going to happen, right? Beyond death. So if you're following, I'm giving some cultural answers to these great human questions before we look at our faith perspective. So the next question, what's wrong with us? And I asked the question, what's wrong with us? You know, there might be a few scattered individuals out there who say, nothing's wrong with us, we're perfectly fine as we are human beings. Well, I always say, just pick up the newspaper, turn on the news in the morning, and you see there's definitely something wrong with us human beings. You know, we turn on the morning television in Nashville, and how many people got shot last night? You know, it's almost every single night. But I also add that you don't really have to look at the news to figure out that there is something wrong with humanity. We can look a little bit closer to home, and I'm not talking about the people we're living with, or our neighbors, or our coworkers. We can also look honestly at ourselves. You know, what is wrong with my own humanity? One way of putting it would be when Paul talks about, why is it that the good that I will to do, I don't end up doing? Why is it that, you know, I want to do that which is right and good, but so often I get into petty squabbling with people? You know, why do I want to be large-hearted and generous and find myself becoming bitter and resentful? So what happens? You know, what's wrong with me? Why am I the way I am? And why are we humans the way that we are? You know, perfectly contented child has his toys, and the neighbor shows up with a neighbor kid, and that child wants to go over and play with one of the toys, and suddenly that's the toy the kid wants, no other toy in the room, you know? So what are the answers we get today? Well, I'll give you the ancient Greek philosophical answer. Socrates, one of the great Western philosophers, felt that the reason human beings end up doing destructive things is that we don't know better. So it's a lack of the proper knowledge of what it means to be human. And sometimes, you know, that's probably true. We don't know. That's how we end up doing destructive things. The psychologists of the 20th century had this kind of big debate that went back and forth between what motivates human behavior. Two great schools of thought. One was most of our behavior was more genetically determined. You know, we're born with certain genes, or kind of our makeup, as it were. Others emphasized it's the way we're shaped and formed by our early life environments. So we're shaped by those environments that we live in. The family system or the larger community systems that we're part of. Can it be both? Well, of course, yes. The great debate is what's more determinative? Is it more our genetics? So we at least have one psychologist in the room who would probably give us a greater, much more in-depth look at the great questions that surrounded how psychologists in the 20th century kind of battled back and forth. There were some interesting experiments that were done. And there are certainly, by the way, some things that our genetics, our genetic makeup, has a significant impact on in terms of human behavior. But most psychologists today, I think, would emphasize more the learned behaviors, how we're affected by the cultures and family systems and community systems that we live in. It's interesting, I hate when I only hear the piece of a program, but I heard a report on NPR the other day, and an author was talking about the fact that they've discovered now when someone undergoes trauma, for example, in a war experience, there are actual changes to the person's DNA that can be traced and detected now. And those genetic markings can be handed on to the offspring. So the same genetic markers are now identifiable so that there's almost a genetic handing on of that DNA effect from parent to offspring from the experience of severe trauma. That's a powerful illustration of an interplay between both DNA, genetics, and the environments that we're living in. So those are common answers. What happened to human beings is shaped around the genetic effects. It's almost certain, for example, if you have a family history of addiction, your chances of becoming addicted to a substance are much greater than someone who has no family background in addiction. Not to say impossible. All right, what's the solution to this human predicament from our cultural point of view? Well, I always like to trace the answers back to the previous question. So if we follow Socrates' line of thought and say our basic human problem is we don't have the right knowledge, we're ignorant, we're in the dark about things, what's the obvious solution? All right, education. And I will also add that, the Greek philosophers were big on that. Lead people to proper knowledge and you'll solve human problems. So for Aristotle, the philosopher king, the one who had studied wisdom, was the best ruler for human beings. And I think a lot of our premise behind the educational system of the United States in the 20th century was predicated upon, if you give people the right knowledge, you can solve a lot of human problems. So it's amazing, though, that as educated as we become, we don't seem to solve the most important ones. And I think it was Einstein who observed, if our moral and spiritual capacities as human beings don't catch up with our scientific, technological capacities, we may be in real trouble as a human race. So there is, so knowledge, if you believe that it's some combination of genetics and social circumstances, there's probably going to be a two-pronged approach to addressing the human problem. One dimension would be what we might call a therapeutic approach, providing proper therapy or counseling to persons who are wounded or suffering. The other would be social transformation. In other words, if the problem is this destructive neighborhood that these kids are growing up in, let's change the social situation. So social transformation and therapeutic methodologies. Did any of y'all see that film this past year called Moonlight? It was like nominated as was it the best film of the year? Did it get the Oscar for the best? It was nominated. It won. So it's not an easy film to watch. So this kid grows up with a drug-addicted mother, and it's based on a true story. And unbeknownst to him at the beginning, he's taken under the wing by his mother's drug dealer. So he provides the drugs, and And so he grows up despising the violence that he sees around him, but by the end of the film, he has almost become the person that the drug dealer was. He's the one selling the drugs on the streets. And you see this process of the culture around him shaping him. Now, I think as dark as the film is and destructive in its portrayal of what happens to human beings, there is a redemptive element about the whole thing. And it shows you that the human being, even sometimes in terrible circumstances, has a resiliency that is absolutely remarkable. So you see sometimes persons emerge in circumstances that you think, how could this person emerge with such resilience and beauty in such a horrible circumstance? So most scientists can't quite figure that out. There is a theological answer, by the way. It's called grace. We can talk about that a bit more. And then the last big question that our culture wrestles with, all human beings have to ask, is what are we doing here? What's our meaning, our purpose in being here in this world during these 70 or 80 or 90 or 125 years that God gives us? You know, well, why are we here? Of course, I threw in the theological dimension already, but the existentialists of the 1960s and 70s, and many people are still existentialists, they just don't know it, would give us the answer. We're each here, we each create our own answer to that question. So the existentialists don't believe that we have a predetermined purpose for being here. They believe that each one of us has to answer that question for ourselves. And we can answer it in an infinite variety of ways. When you look at the way people live out their life, they sort of answer it by the way they live their life, don't they? Why am I here? What am I doing? What's my purpose and why? We might have a mental answer, but we usually answer it by what we actually spend our time and money on, how we live our day in and day out living. So, I wanted to do a quick contemporary overview of our culture today with these great questions. And now I want to focus a bit on our Catholic Christian understanding of the answers to these great questions. So when you start applying the lens of faith to these great questions and ask the question, where did we come from? The answer may surprise you, because remember last week I talked about how Catholics are not either-or thinkers. Like the Protestant perspective, we are both and thinkers. So we as Catholics can say that there is nothing that science would ever discover that would be in true opposition to what God reveals. So there is no conflict ultimately between knowledge that is ascertained through science and that which we know through faith. So even if the scientist theory is correct, and there's a lot of evidence to support the theory of evolution and the origins of the universe, the dimension that is beyond that is the one that I hinted at when I asked the question, why is there something here rather than nothing? And the answer would be, we fundamentally believe that everything that we see in existence, the entire universe and every human person, are created by a loving God. So that's the Catholic Christian answer. In the ancient world, there were many creation stories or myths. Some of them had human beings appearing on the planet, in the world, because of conflicts between the gods. So, a result of a great battle, and human beings were one of the end results. It is in our unique Judeo-Christian appreciation of things, and with that, Muslim brothers and sisters would be in agreement, that we believe that the whole universe and everything in it, and all human beings that ever were, are, or ever shall be, were created by a loving God, in the image and likeness of God, we even say. So, could God have used the mechanism of evolution to do so? Absolutely. So, all the way back to the 1950s, Pope Pius XII began to speak about that some of the current theories about evolution may in fact have some truth to them. So this was an important moment in the development of modern scientific answers to questions and the dialogue with the church. You may know that the Vatican today, and for the last 50 years, has really been at the forefront of dialogue with science. So there's actually at the Vatican a Vatican observatory, and they have important international conferences where they discuss the important questions of how science and faith intersect. And so I went to a liberal arts Catholic college. I was a science major before I switched to history, so I took a lot of classes in science, and one in astronomy, a lot of biology classes. The DNA connections between us and the lowest form of life on the planet are remarkably close. We share an incredible DNA connection with the rest of living beings on the planet. Even plants and humans share a lot of common DNA. And DNA really is the mechanism of life on our planet. It's how life grows and develops and changes over time. So I think that there is a lot to be said about what scientists have discovered about how life evolves. The unique response of the Catholic tradition on this score, though, would be that the human person, in distinction to the rest of created beings, all living things, has been endowed with something that we call the soul. And what is the soul? Essentially, it is our godlike capacity. It is the ability to know and to love and to choose in freedom. So we believe that all human beings, because of this, have something that makes us distinct from the rest of this world of life around us. So as connected as we might be with horses and dogs and cats and lions and tigers, and by the way, if you really want to be convinced that we're kind of connected to animals, go visit a zoo and watch the animals closely for a while. They're really not in some ways. Watch the monkeys and the gorillas, and, even visit the wolves in the Memphis Zoo. You feel this kinship with created things. And people like St. Francis, by the way, have a mystical awareness of that. The story about the wolf of Gubbio was harassing the villagers in the village of Gubbio, and they pleaded with Francis to help them with the wolf. And Francis went out, and the wolf charged him as it charged all the villagers. And Francis made the sign of the cross over the wolf and counseled the wolf no longer to harass the villagers. And then he turned to the villagers and said, and you should no longer harass the wolf either. You all should live in peace with each other. And the wolf responded by becoming docile before Francis. And Francis would also preach to the birds. So the Christian answer is a both and. We can believe in all the evidence of science that we learn and revel in it, but there is in our understanding an intentionality behind it that comes from the loving Creator. Now, where are we going? One answer is our destination, and I'll come back to it, but I want to rearrange the questions for a moment from a Catholic Christian point of view. Let's go to the next one. What's wrong with us? And again, you may be surprised by the answer, but we Catholics are not either or people, we're both and people. So we will actually agree with the Greek philosophers and say sometimes the reason that human beings don't do what we're called to do or be or live what we're supposed to live is a lack of knowledge. We really are ignorant through no fault of our own. So we acknowledge there's a fundamental truth, and so it is important to educate and bring knowledge to people. We will also acknowledge, by the way, that there are certain givens in life, that human freedom, though given by God, is not absolute, that there is, in fact, a limit to it. And therefore, we are affected by the environments that we grow up in and the genetics that we've been given. Probably one of the more genetic predispositions that we have is how quiet or outgoing we are. Is that sort of genetically so, or is that? Yeah, lots of genetics in that. So some of our behavior is in fact shaped to some degree by our genetic predisposition, and certainly by the environment that we grow up in. And when we think environment, we shouldn't think in terms of big environment all the time, although that everything, all the dimensions of environment shape the human person. But you might ask, why is it that two people living in the same house, growing up with the same parents, sometimes have very different outcomes? Remember that the environment that we grow up in is individually shaped by individual experiences, even in that small of an environment, the way that we perceive those individual experiences. So it could be that there were, in fact, differences in the experiences of children growing up in very similar environments that affected each sibling in a very unique kind of way. So we as Catholics would say all of that is true, and therefore the psychotherapeutic methods and working to change the social world that we live in and improve social functioning are all important and necessary goals. But there is also something deeper, we believe, that's wrong with the human person. And what's that deeper thing that's wrong with us? We capture it with one word, by the way. Or we use the word sin to describe it. But we use that word in two important, connected, but distinct ways. So we're afflicted by what we might call original sin and the results of original sin. So the core behind original sin is that when we're born, even though God creates this universe very good, and each and every human person is fundamentally created in the image and likeness of God, from the very first moment that we start living this existence out, we're also affected by what we call the ripple effects of sin. So when you throw a rock in a pond, what happens? There are ripples that go out to affect the whole surface of the water. And so every single human being is born into a world that has those ripple effects of all the pre-existing sin that preceded us, going back to the very first willful turning from the mystery of our Creator. So the narrative in Genesis describes in a narrative form very profoundly the core mystery of what happens with sin. And if you want to look at it in a certain way, the core narrative in Genesis is about God creating the beginnings of the human family and placing them in a garden that we call Eden. It's a garden where there is a loving communion between human beings. They don't have barriers between them yet. They're unclothed. Nor are there barriers between themselves and their Creator and the creation around them. But the way the Genesis narrative unfolds the story, what happens? Discontentment is introduced into the picture. You will be like gods if you ... And so wanting to be like gods, to have the knowledge of good and evil, and by the way, we can only have the knowledge of good and evil if we have an experience of evil. At whatever moment that original misuse of human freedom, a willful turning, you see in the narrative of Genesis what happens. Alienation from oneself. How does that express itself? Shame. I now cover myself with clothing. I'm no longer at peace with being who I am. Alienation between humans. You see that reflected right away in the narrative. Why, God asks, why did you do that? Well, that woman you put here, she's the problem. He blaming the other person. So shame with oneself, blame for the other, and it affects our relationship with creation. So from now on, childbearing is going to be terribly painful. It's going to require work to labor to get your food from the earth. The serpent will strike at your heel while you strike at its head. So you see this ripple effect that begins to disintegrate the original wholeness. This is what we call original sin in its origins. But the effects of it have rippled throughout time and history, and every one of us have been afflicted by the effects of original sin, directly or indirectly. So the exceptions, by the way, in Catholic theology to at least not the exterior effects, but more the internal bending of our human desire away from God. The exceptions are Mary, protected by God at the first moment of her conception through the redemption to be wrought in Christ and Jesus himself, who we say is fully human, but never sinned, so he never turned from God, uniquely in the human race, unaffected by having our own interiority, our own desires warped against us and warped against our Creator. So the rest of us have these fundamentally good desires, but also have an element of warping away from their created purpose. So that's why for example, it's a perfectly legitimate desire to be secure. You know, I want a roof over my head, I want to be rained on, I don't want my neighbor to hit me over the head with a rock, so I have this desire to be secure. But something happens to that desire for security. So I begin to imagine my neighbor's going to club me over the head with a rock, so before he can do it, I get the branch out of the tree and club him over the head. So my desire for security suddenly got warped, and I used it in a destructive way against my neighbor. So that's a tiny little microcosm of what happens to these essentially God-given desires that have become warped by the effects of original sin. So original sin is that original warping away from God that now has afflicted by its effects all of us. So we're not born without any of us escaping its influence. One could also add, by the way, you can connect the social psychiatric theories with theological answers and say that, in fact, the destructive social environments that people grow up in and the disintegration of the person may have also been affected by the results of original sin. That's why they are the way they are. And the second dimension to sin, of course, is what we call personal sin. So it's my contribution to the darkness in the world. It's when I freely choose to add to the destructiveness. And then my personal turnings away from God also add to that greater cloud of darkness in the world. So, but consequently, by the way, do my loving, attentive actions, they also ripple out. So I love St. Paul's reflection on Adam and Christ in his letter to the Romans. Paul says, if sin entered the world through one man, Adam, then still greater things have come through the new Adam, who is Christ, who has undone the whole thing. So we'll look at that in just a moment. So let's look at what the solution is to this problem. So we've already talked about the solutions, again, both and, psychotherapeutic methodologies, social work to improve society, critically important, education, knowledge. But in addition to that, we need a remedy for the condition of the human person that is beyond anything that we can do ourselves. And in the Hebrew language, they called it, we all need redemption, a redeemer. So when you were when you were a slave in the ancient world, you were someone's property. So once you were the property of another person, what could you do to get out of your slavery?
Nothing.
Oh, no, you can't buy yourself free. If you're someone's property, you don't have any money to buy yourself free. You can't buy yourself free. If you're someone's property, you don't own anything, you belong to somebody else, you have no property of your own. You don't work your way out because everything that you ever work to make goes to your owner. There's what? You escape and run away, okay? There was only one way ultimately out of slavery in the ancient world. All right, you've got the answer. In Hebrew, the word is goel. Someone who had the money would say, I'm going to buy you out of your slavery. So they would give to the person who owned the slave the money to free the slave. And once they were paid for, then they were set free. That's how they redeemed slaves in the ancient world. So what God's people came to the fundamental conviction was that all human beings, because of the effects of personal and original sin, that we are afflicted with a remedy that we ourselves cannot fix. So in the end, we can help each other, but we can't ultimately heal the human person at the core. So we need a Redeemer who has the ability to heal us to the core, and God alone can do that. So without the grace of God, given freely, and we as Christians say given freely through the death and resurrection of His Son, none of us could be healed to the core. So in the end, for all human beings to be finally liberated, We need the effects of grace itself, given freely from God as a free, unearned gift. So that's why I said earlier, when you hear about a kid that grows up in a horrific place, in the most horribly violent place, and becomes an extraordinarily good human being, how does that happen? There's almost no explanation beyond grace. You know, without theological lenses, it's hard to explain such things. But the grace of God does for people what they can't do for themselves. And so ultimately, the deepest healing that we need is to be rescued, saved, as it were, redeemed by God Himself. And we as Christians say it happens through the mystery of Christ in His incarnation, in His life, His death, His resurrection, and the giving of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. So for us, that's the final solution. And so the last question, why are we here and where are we going? That's two questions. We believe where we are going, that we are destined for something more, that life does not end with death, but is a gateway to something more, and we call it personal resurrection from the dead. So I'm not going to disappear like a drop of water back into the ocean. That would be a more Eastern Buddhist Hindu kind of understanding. But my humanity as a person will continue. I will have the capacity to know and love in a way that's beyond what I know and love I'm able to do in this life. So that the finitude that I experience here will be liberated. And in the Christian tradition, especially in the ancient church and in the Eastern traditions, we become godlike. So they would say, in the Eastern church, we become God because we are not by nature, but by adoption, by union with God. So God takes us to Himself, yet we remain still creatures, distinct at the same time. So we express this, by the way, in the Apostles' Creed in a powerful way when we say we believe in the resurrection of the body. So I know some Christians have believed that we would only be spirits floating around in heaven, but we speak about a new heavens and a new earth, a new creation, and the human person raised from the dead will be an integral being. Now, the bodies that we experience in eternity are not bound by finitude, by the limits of human weakness and sickness and death and decay. So they will be what Paul called a spiritual body, pneumatikos, or a glorified body, much after the manner of the risen body of Jesus. So one not confined by space and time. What is that? That's a mystery. We don't know what a glorified body is beyond the narratives in the Gospels that encounter with the risen Lord that have come down to us. So a personal resurrection. And the final answer to why we're here, what's our meaning or purpose, the way that Jesus Himself expressed it in the Gospels, we are to love the Lord our God, our Creator, with all of our heart, our mind, our soul, and our strength, and we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. And that's not a bad summation of why we're here on the planet. What did the Baltimore Catechism used to say? Why did God create us? To know, to love, and to serve God in this life, and to be happy with Him forever in the next. So that we, in this life, we're given the privilege of knowing God, loving God, and serving God as we love and serve each other. And the beautiful way John's Gospel puts it, by the way, and the words of Jesus are, as the Father has loved me, so also I love you. Live on in my love, and you will live in my love by loving one another as I love you. So as this movement of the Father's love through the Son into us, and we are loving each other as we are loved by God. And I always think if you break that stuff apart a bit, if we love God with all of our being, everything that we're capable of, and we love each other as a self, as we love ourselves, there is a proper self-respect and dignity at the core of that. We know that we belong to God, we're beloved of God, we're God's beloved sons and daughters, and from that inherent awareness of our dignity as God's beloved, experiencing that we are loved by God, we're thus able to love others in a fully free and loving kind of way that's not destructive of ourselves or the other. So that's the great purpose for which we are here. Saint Ignatius, in his preamble to the exercises, says that I'm paraphrasing, but every single thing in creation is given to us as a gift by God for the purpose of allowing us to return a life of praise, adoration, thanks, and praise to God, so that we may live with Him forever in eternity. And then, but Ignatius goes on to say, so insofar as any of these created things become a barrier to our ultimate purpose, we must let go of them. But insofar as they assist us in that process, are we able to use them for the glory of God. So for Ignatius, one has to evaluate every created thing that we ever experience from the ultimate lens of, is this helping me to become the loving person God creates me to be, or is it alienating me from that, separating me from God for all eternity? So we always have to choose that which will bring us to become the creatures that God created us to be, to the praise and glory of God. So this is kind of a theological anthropology, we call it. It's a way that we look at the human person from the lens of Christian faith. But I wanted you to see it in dialogue with the world today for two reasons. One, because everybody we meet on the street is living an answer to these great questions. Some are in communion with us and some are not. And it's important also that we remember the both and, that there's elements of truth in what everybody is saying out there, but we always say that there's a fuller picture that we always have to remind people of in the great story of being human. So look forward to seeing you all next week. And next week we're going to be looking at the mystery of God. So once we have considered our state as human beings with this infinite desire, who ask great questions and have to live the answers, we need to look next to the mystery of the God who created us. So let's end with a glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end.